All right, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar about CloudBees Rollout and Feature Flag Management Made Easy. Just a few things to let everyone know up top. One, we are recording. If you need to leave early or maybe have a colleague who's unable to join, they will be able to view this later on. Two, there will be time at the end for questions. As soon as you think of a question, please feel free to put it right into that question panel. Even if you think maybe we'll get to it during the presentation, it's still good to see what everyone would like to know more about. Speaking of that, at the very end, when I close this out, a very short survey will pop up just asking what you thought, what you'd like to learn more about in the future. If you're on the air and you'd like to answer that for us, it'd be very appreciated. I don't want to take up too much more of the time right here at the beginning, so I think I'd like to pass it right over to our presenter, Greg Absick, to get us started. Greg.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you for joining the webinar on Feature Flag Management Made Easy. First, let me introduce myself. So as Max said, my name is Greg Absick, and I'm a software delivery advocate here at CloudBees. So today we're gonna go over just high-level introduction to feature flags, feature toggles, some people call them. Then we'll talk about feature flag use cases. Then I'll mention how to use Rollout specifically to manage your feature flags, and then I'll dive into a little bit of a demo on Rollout itself. And as Max mentioned, if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to ask them, and then we'll get to them at the end. So first off, an introduction to feature flags. So feature flagging is a method to show or hide software features at runtime. Features are coded with a flag and then released to production systems, right? But these features are only exposed to a given user if that user meets the criteria for the experiment. So you have code, but it's wrapped in a feature flag, and then at runtime, that feature flag is evaluated based on user properties, for example, and then based on those properties, it's decided if this feature is going to be displayed to the given user or not, right? That's what a feature flag is at a very high level. So here we have an example of how you would actually implement a feature flag in your code. Again, very simple. Let me get my little pointer here. Right here at the top, we're just defining our flags here inside of a constant, right? This is JavaScript, by the way. So we're defining our flag here, for example, right? This following view, this is now a flag. And then in our code itself, right, we're wrapping this code, this div, we're wrapping it in our feature flag. Right, so if you can read this, it's basically saying if the following view feature flag is enabled, then go ahead and show this div, and then if it's not enabled, then don't show anything, right? So again, feature flags on their own, very easy to kind of introduce into the code. It's basically just a simple conditional to decide which code you're going to show, which code you're gonna run. And here is the feature flag in action, right? So on the left here, the feature flag that I kind of showed implemented in the code, right? This is what it looks like if that feature flag is set to false, right? You see there's no UI component here whatsoever. But if we set that feature flag to true for this user, then we can see, okay, cool, now this UI component shows up. Again, really simple. You're taking a UI component, wrapping it in a conditional. If the value is true for the user, then the user would see this screen. If the value is false for the user, then the user would see this screen. So now that we know what feature flags are, right, how to implement them simply, the question comes up, why do you want to use feature flags, right? And a big part of that is today, a lot of software delivery is done by versions, right? The process of getting a new version of your code out into production, getting a new feature release out there can be a very cumbersome process, very manual, right? Just big development teams sitting around making sure all of your artifacts are grouped together correctly, flipping the right switches at the right time, making sure that production environment is looking good, running smoothly, right? And this process, it can be costly, very manual, can lead to development headaches, right? I'm sure a lot of you have experience using feature branches in your code, right, on GitHub. And so with a problem with feature branches, right, sometimes features end up becoming huge and the feature branches end up living for months at a time, and then you try to merge your feature branch back into master, and you have a ton of merge conflicts because while you're working on this one feature, everybody else already merged their features into master, so you just have merge conflicts, and that takes away from development time, right? It slows down the time it takes your code to actually end up in production. and feature flags are a nice way to kind of get around all the pains associated with this kind of version development, right? By wrapping your code in feature flags, you're able to push to master a lot quicker, right? You're able to separate your code deployments from your feature releases, right? With a feature flag around your code, you can deploy your code to production and know that no customer, no user is actually going to be exposed to that code. So that's a really nice way of just speeding up your production time, your development time. You can test in production and things like that. So we're going to talk about some use cases for feature flags. And I'm going to mention each one of these more specifically as I go through the slides, but these are just some common use cases that people see when it comes to utilizing feature flags. Deployments with less hassle. I mentioned that a little bit in the previous slide, right? But just being able to deploy quicker, push code onto production quicker without necessarily exposing the code to your customers. Separating your code deployments from your feature releases, right? This really helps speed up the cycle time. Deployment safety, feature by wrapping all of your code in a feature flag, you can actually very easily just shut off a feature with a click of a button, right? Instead of in the past, where if you push some code into production, it ends up breaking, you then have to go back into the code, type up a fix, push that fix all the way into production, release it correctly, and that's the fix. Whereas now you can just click a button, shuts off the feature, your production environment is safe. Experimentation, that is, a word, A/B testing, right? Analytics, running analytics on your features. So I'll dive into that in a little bit more detail. Customization, that is basically showing different users different features, right, based on user properties. So maybe you have beta testers that you want to expose the feature only to them, right? So how do you expose your code only to your beta testers and not all of your other users, right? By using the properties associated with the user. And finally, visibility, I think, is a very important thing when it comes to using feature flags. Being able to see all of your feature flags across all of your code, see what users are exposed to and things like that. That plays a really important role in feature flags. So the first use case, deployments with less hassle. How do feature flags help you avoid the hassle of complicated deployments, right? So you can release features right after announcing them, right? Have you ever wondered how, at a tech conference, somebody can announce a new feature, and then as soon as they're done talking, that feature is live, right? It's not necessarily that they have some developers sitting in the back pushing the changes to production as the person is speaking, right? They probably just have a feature flag around their code, and then as soon as that person is done presenting, you just flip the switch, and now the new feature that they were talking about is live. It's exposed to all of the users, right? You can also do dark launches with feature flags. Dark launches are a way to introduce changes into your production environment, right? A way to release features without anyone actually knowing that you've really done anything, right? No big press release, no nothing. Your user is using your app or your web app at the time, and then the next time they log in, well, there's a whole brand new login page, and you just did that with a flip of a switch very easily. It enables your applications to be backwards compatible, so you can have different versions of your code deployed to different environments, right? So if you have someone who's using an older piece of hardware and it can only run version 1.0 of your application, you can make sure that users of this device only see version 1.0 of your application, for example. And you can also test in production using feature flags, which leads to less hassle with deployments, right? You can push out, that's kind of what this image is down here. You can push out code into production and then only let members, QA members see the code. Nobody else will be able to see that feature, right? By testing in production, you can really make sure that the feature you're about to release behaves correctly, works correctly in your production environment. Another use case is separating code deployments from feature releases, and I've talked about this a little bit already, right? The idea of merge conflict hell when using feature branches, right? Having these long-lived feature branches, you're constantly pushing code to them. They're becoming more and more complex, diverging more and more from your master branches, so that by the time it finally comes to having to merge your feature branch into master, you just get a bunch of merge conflicts. It takes up a lot of time to actually get that branch merged into master, right? And feature flags are a way to avoid this, to really kind of speed up the cycle of merging off master, but then merging back into it, right? by having to deal with these merge conflicts, you're taking away valuable time from your development team that they could be focusing on developing, right? So by introducing feature flags into your code, you could constantly push your code, even if it's not done, but since the code is wrapped in feature flags and toggled off, that code doesn't actually make it out to anyone that it will have an effect on. Deployment safety is another big use case when it comes to feature flags. And I mentioned this. So obviously the feature kill switch is a really big example, and that's what this picture is here on the left, right? You can push out a feature into production, but since it's wrapped in a feature flag and you can control that feature flag, you have the option to just kill the feature flag, basically, right? You press this button, it kills the feature, sets the feature flag to false. Really quick way to roll back a feature, basically, no hassle whatsoever. You don't have to spend time pushing out a fix immediately. You can just turn your feature off. And another aspect of deployment safety that feature flags help with is you're able to do gradual deployments. If you have a feature that you're unsure of how it will perform, you can actually expose it only to a really small subset of users. And if something does go wrong, something only went wrong for that small subset of users, right? You didn't expose your whole user base to this feature that went poorly. So that's another aspect that feature flags help with. Experimentation. So I mentioned that before, right? It was basically being able to measure feature impact, seeing how a specific feature is performing with your users, looking at impressions, A/B testing, right? Maybe you want to try out 2 different versions of your homepage to see which one will get more customer interaction, right? So you would actually push out 2 different versions of your homepage to, one homepage to 50% of your users, the other homepage to the other 50%, and then you could track which one is performing better with your customers, and then whichever one starts performing better, you would scale that up, and then the one that's performing worse, you would scale that down. That's the idea behind A/B testing, is exposing 2 different features to 2 different groups, seeing which one performs better, running analytics on it, helping you decide which features you really want to pursue. Customization, so that's customizing, feature behavior based on user preferences, different features for different users. You have the ability of grouping users into specific target groups. That's what you see here on the left, right? You can create a premium user target group, for example, right? And so at runtime, you would check the user property in your code, and you would check what payment plan is this user utilizing, right? And if their payment plan is the premium payment plan, that means they're a premium user. Whereas if their payment plan is something else, they're not a premium user, right? And then you can design your features based off of these target groups and release certain features only to certain users. That's the idea behind customization. And then finally, visibility, which I think is a very important aspect of a feature flag management system, right? Is being able to know how your features are behaving across all of your environments. And this is like a picture of the Rollout dashboard, and you can see all your feature flags that are active in your production environment, the impressions associated with it, what percentage of users it's exposed to, things like that, right? So having this high-level overview of all of your feature flags across the board is very important. And so all I've talked about so far, that's just feature flags in general. And I've shown, how easy feature flags are to implement in the code. So the question might come up, if I can do this myself, it is really easy, right? It's just a conditional in my code. Why would I want a feature flag management solution like Rollout, right? What does that offer me? And so Rollout or other feature flag management services, they offer a couple of different things that kind of a homegrown solution might not offer you, right? The biggest one that I talked about a little bit in the last slide, I think, is management and visibility, right? As you scale up, hopefully utilizing more and more feature flags can become a little bit of a hassle just maintaining them, keeping track of all of them. The more you have, it becomes harder and harder to manage all of them. So having this high-level UI, being able to monitor all of your flags across your systems, being able to set user permissions, so making it so only specific users can control feature flags that are active in your production environment, things like that, being able to run analytics, having audit logs around your feature flags, right? Those are all things that you would have to either build yourself as part of a homegrown solution, or you just wouldn't have access to if you're just utilizing the simple in-code feature flags. Visibility, I mentioned that in the last slide. Again, having just a central UI where you can see all of the flags that you have active across all of your environments, being able to see which users the features are exposed to in which environment. Again, very nice thing that you would not have unless you built out your own UI to go along with your homegrown feature flag solution. Cross-platform support is another big one. If you're doing homegrown feature flags, you would then have to develop feature flags for multiple languages, right? And it becomes really hard if you want to release a feature for a feature that entails both front end and back end components. For example, if you want to release that on your own, controlling both from the same kind of feature flag, that can be really tough to manage. Whereas with the rollout dashboard, it, again, gives you the central view, central control of a multi-platform solution, right? It's a hosted solution as well, so you don't have to worry about setting up any infrastructure or anything like that. And there's just a ton other more features and capabilities that I'll be going over in the demo in a second. And so that's the segue here. I'll be showing a quick little demo of feature flags in code and then how they're applied in the UI and how to control them using the rollout dashboard. So this is a locally hosted little JavaScript web app that I'll be showing feature flags on. It's a little SoundCloud clone, open source SoundCloud clone. And so I'll be going into this user's web page here. And as you can see on the right here, we have this UI component called following users, right? And so this user is following 50 users. And what we're going to do is we're going to gate this UI component behind a feature flag. So first, I'm going to jump into the code. And the reason I'm going to be showing, I'll go through the code a little quickly, but the reason I want to highlight the code is because feature flags are implemented in the code, right? You're going to be using feature flags to wrap your code in. And so I think it's important to highlight how you would actually do that in the code first. So the first file that you're looking at is this flags.js file, and this is called a container class. And the container class is where you actually would define your feature flags and you would do the initial setup to start utilizing Rollout. So at the top here, we have our import statement. We're importing the Rollout SDK. And then here inside this flags constant, we're actually defining all of the feature flags that we're going to be utilizing throughout the rest of the code base here. And then down here, we have a couple of registration and setup calls to establish the connection between my local device and the Rollout dashboard. So I'm going to jump into this user.js file. This is the code behind this user page, right? And then this div right here that I'm highlighting right now, that's the div associated with this following users view, right? And then I'm just gonna wrap this div in a conditional like I showed earlier, right? If the following you flag is enabled, then go ahead and show this div, and then if it's not, show nothing, right? I'm gonna save that, and it's JavaScript, so it's gonna update the page automatically. And as you can see, this UI component is now gone, right? And the reason for that is when you first define a feature flag in your code, like you do here, by default, it's set to false, right? So if the flags following view is enabled, show this, but the flags following view is not enabled, so it's showing nothing, right? You can override that in the code with your initial setup. I could set it to true if I wanted to and save it that way, but we're gonna leave it as false. So we've created the feature flag in our code. We've wrapped some of our code in that feature flag, right? And now I'm gonna show how you would control that feature flag in the dashboard. There is one thing I want to highlight first before I leave my local UI. Rollout really prides itself at being a developer-focused tool, developer-friendly tool. And so we have a couple of little things that we offer to make the lives of developers and QA testers easier when it comes to implementing feature flags. And so this comes built in with the SDK. We've implemented this in our UI, and this is called the rocks overrides view. And I, as a developer, I can actually toggle different feature flag values just on my own locally to be able to test out my feature flags, right? So I have the following view feature flag in my code, but if I, as a developer, I want to just test out this feature, make sure it behaves correctly in the UI, I can actually go ahead and click this, set it to true, refresh the page, and now the component, now the feature flag is set to true, so now the component displays. So this is just a nice way for developers and testers to be able to test out their changes without having to actually go into the code to toggle the different values, without having to go into the dashboard, ask somebody to toggle the value for me, right? This is just something to help local development, a nice little nifty tool. So I'm gonna set that back to false, refresh the page, and now it's gone. So let's jump into the rollout dashboard itself. So at this point, we've created the feature flag in the code, right? We've wrapped our code inside this feature flag, and now I'm gonna show how you would actually control that feature flag via the dashboard. So this is what the rollout dashboard looks like. In the top left, we have our application dropdown, so you can have as many applications as you want inside of your dashboard. We're going into the Sound Redux application here. You can see on the left, we have our different environments, right? Prod, stage, and dev. That's kind of the standard environment setup. You can add as many environments as you want here and control them. So for the sake of the demo, we're just going to assume that we're in the production environment, right? And so we've created the following new feature flag in the code, but as of now, there's no controller for it, right? There's no experiment yet created for the following view feature flag. So when I click into the production environment in the experiments view, that actually shows all of the feature flags that are currently being controlled in the production environment, right? So you can see the name of the feature flag, you can see its status, you can see when it was created, when this controller itself was last edited, and then you can see impressions, so how many users have interacted with this feature, and then you see kind of like the split, so the rules for that feature flag as well. So this is a nice high-level overview of a specific environment, and then you can sort by different options in here, things like that. But we don't have a following view controller yet, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to click on this create experiment button, and this will create an experiment, right? And an experiment is a way for you to control a specific feature flag from the dashboard. So this dropdown right here is actually populated with all of the values that we defined in our code, right? So all of the feature flags that you defined in the code inside of your container class, they will be available when you go to create a new experiment. So I'll click on following view. You can also create a new flag in the UI first, right? You don't have to create a feature flag in the code first. You could create an experiment in the dashboard around a new flag that doesn't exist yet, such as test flag, for example, right? And then you can set all the rules for this new flag that doesn't actually exist in the code yet. You just have to go into the code and implement that flag as well. But this is a nice way for, if you split up a story, right, where there's a new feature being developed, and at the same time, you want to create the controller for that new feature, right? Create the feature flag, create the controller for that feature flag at the same time. You can do that. You can have somebody working on the feature flag and the feature flag rules, and then a developer who's actually working on the feature itself. You don't have to wait for the developer to create the feature flag to create the rules around it. But we'll go ahead and we'll pick the following view feature flag, and I'm going to click set audience, right? And this will create the default behavior for this feature flag in my dashboard, right? And I'm saying default behavior, as you can see, all versions and all users is currently grayed out. I can't change this, right? And the reason for that is you need to have a default behavior for your feature flag. No matter what, user properties or whatever, this feature needs a default behavior. And so by default, this will be set to false. You can change it to true if you want. So now if I were to update the audience, all users would see the following view feature. You can also do a split, which is how you would do kind of like a gradual rollout, right? So I can set it so 10% of users will see this feature, 90% will not, right? And then I could come back in and change it to 20, change it to 30. And a thing to keep in mind is everything you're seeing me doing in the dashboard when it pertains to creating an experiment, controlling the environments, controlling the experiments, there is also a REST API available, right? So you can really automate this kind of split deployment, this gradual deployment as well. And I'll touch on the API a little bit later. A question that comes up quite a bit is how does this split actually work, right? If I set a 10%, 90% split, how does Rollout actually make sure that which user falls under the true category, which users fall under the false category? And so the way that works is Rollout will generate basically an ID number on each user's device, right? We will generate a number between 0 and 1, a decimal value. And if that value, for example, let's say for me, that value is 0.25, right? 0.25 would mean I fall under the false category, right? Because 0.25 is greater than 0.1, so I'm in the false category. But that value is sticky, right? So, and this is a value generated per experiment, right? So this value is generated for me for the following view experiment, 0.25, right? But as this changes, as this goes up to 20, as it goes up to 30, my value doesn't change. So now that we're up to a 30-70 split, now I'm inside the true bucket. So now I would see that feature, right? So that's how this kind of split percentage works. We also have the scheduled option, which is similar to the split option, but you can also tie a specific date around it, right? So I can set it true for no customers right now, but then for tomorrow, let's expose it to 10% of our users, right? And I can keep adding more and more dates to kind of create this gradual rollout as well. And then on Friday, let's expose it to 20% of our users, right? So this is another way to control the user percentages that you're exposing this feature to. But for now, let's leave the default behavior as false. We don't want all of our users seeing it, right? Let's control what users will see it based on user properties, for example. So first thing I'm going to highlight, I'll set this to true, is maybe you want to control what versions you expose this to, right? So this is very common in the mobile world, for example, where maybe I only want users who are on application version 2.0 of my application or higher to be able to see this following view feature. Anyone who's on a version lower than that, they won't have access to this feature yet, right? So that's a way to control that. Or maybe I'm fine with all versions, but I don't want to expose this feature to all users. Maybe I want to do a property match, right? So I would go in here and maybe I want to expose this only to my, let's say, Americans customers, right? So I could do property country equals one of, and then I would go in here and I would add USA, hit enter, hit save, and now if I were to save this, right, this feature would only show up to users whose country property is USA. And so one thing you might be asking right now is, where does this property dropdown come from, right? How does this get populated? And so by default, Rollout will have a couple just default property values that come built in, and those are, you can see those are rocks dot whatever. But then all of these other ones in here, those are actually exposed through the code. So let me jump into the code real quick to show you how that's done, right? So in our JavaScript code, we have this user object, right? And the user object has an email property there. And so I can actually, through the code, let the Rollout dashboard know, hey, there's an email property. And now I can go into the dropdown and I can use this email property to define my feature flag properties as well. So any property that's available in the code, you can then choose to expose it to the Rollout dashboard. But one thing to keep in mind on, and I'll touch on this when I go over kind of the security and the architecture here, is even though you're exposing the user email property to the Rollout dashboard, you're not exposing the user data itself, right? And that's very important to keep in mind. You're basically letting Rollout know that there isn't a property called email, but all of the user kind of data, all of the logic of determining if a user, of determining if this feature should be displayed to this user, that's handled on the user's device, right? And I'll go over that when I get to the architecture slide, but basically Rollout will generate a config file, a config JSON file from the dashboard. It will send that config JSON file to the user's device, and then the user's device will actually check on the user's device, right? No data comes to our servers. It will check on the user's device. Oh, okay, is my email right now, is the current email right now, my email, right? It would check that. If it is, then yeah, I would see this feature. If that email, if the users whose device we're on, that email does not match that property, then he wouldn't see this feature flag, right? You can also do a target group for your feature flag. So a target group, I'll go over that in a second, how you create one. But basically a target group is a way to group specific users into a group, again, based on their properties, right? So I've already created a DJ target group. We're going with the SoundCloud theme here, right? And so this is a way to set it so only users that are within the DJ target group will be able to see this feature, right? Or instead of a target group, you could also create flag dependencies, which I think is a really powerful tool. And there's a reason for that, right? Features don't exist in a vacuum, right? You will have features that depend on other features. And so the worst thing you could do is expose a feature that has a dependency on another feature, but have that other feature turned off for the specific user, right? Because then that introduces a big problem in your production environment and so on. So this is a way to kind of control that. And as you can see here, this logic is basically, if the shuffle flag is true for this user, only then show the following view feature as well. If the shuffle flag was false for this user, then they wouldn't see this feature, right? And that's how you can kind of control the feature dependencies between each other. So let me jump into target groups because we were just talking about that. So a target group, again, is just a way to group users based on their properties. And so instead of having to utilize kind of the same property in each experiment that I'm creating, I can create a one-off group, and then I can use that group in multiple places, right? And so for our DJ target group, for example, we have our playlist count, right? That's the property that we're checking. So if a user's playlist count is greater than or equal to 101, then that user is considered a DJ, right? And so you can also see where this target group is being utilized. You can see that it's being utilized in our production environment and our development environment. There's a nice high-level overview, just being able to see where these target groups are being used, and you can actually expand that, and it will take you to any experiments that are utilized in that target group. So you can see this row likes experiment, for example, has the DJ target group in use, right? And so when you create a new target group, right, let's say I wanted to create an internal testers target group, right? And this would be a way when I, push a feature out into production, I don't want to release it to everyone yet. Maybe I just want to release it to my internal testers first. And then once they sign off on it, then we kind of start rolling out the feature, right? So let's create the internal testers target group. So again, this is kind of based on property conditions. So maybe my internal testers are people who, email domain ends with @cloudbees.com, for example, right? So not the best regex here, but you get the idea, right? Anyone whose email ends @cloudbees.com, I'm assuming they're a CloudBees employee, and so I'm going to make them internal testers, right? So when I release a feature into production, I can choose to only release it to people whose email ends in @cloudbees.com, and then once they've all signed off on that feature, it looks good, it works correctly in production, then we can start rolling out this feature to other people. Well, that's how you create a target group. Again, this dropdown, this property dropdown, is populated from the code, right? So any property that's available in the code, you can expose it to the Rollout dashboard, and now we can use it when creating target groups or when setting rules for a specific feature flag. So another thing I wanted to highlight was audit logs. I'll touch on this, just talking about security and things like that. Any change that happens in this dashboard on an environment level, you'll be able to see inside these audit logs. So you can see I've deleted experiments, I've created experiments. If somebody changes the rules, that will come in here, right? And this is per environment. So you have audit logs for the staging environment, you have audit logs for the production environment. And this is just a really nice way to really see and have control over who's changing the flag rules, who's done what with your environments, right? Because you want to be able to see if somebody makes a change that affects your production environment, you need to be able to see who did what and when, and that's what this view is for. We also have this flags view, and this ties into the visibility use case that I was talking about earlier. This is a very high level overview of all of the feature flags that you have across all of your environments and also across all of your platforms, right? So you can see that this playlist flag, for example, is active for our Android platforms, and then you can see what percentage of users it's actually exposed to in our environments. So in the development environment, it's exposed to 100% of our users. In the staging environment, it's only exposed to none of our users, right? But so this is a nice way to be able to see this one singular view of where all your feature flags are, how they're performing, things like that. And then you can actually click into each one, and it would take you to the rules of that specific experiment, right? The ones in red, those are archived feature flags. And so what that means, right, let me go into the following view. Once you've exposed your feature flag to all of your users, right, this feature flag has been scaled up to 100% of your users, it's fully out there in production, you don't necessarily need the flag there anymore, right? And so the idea there is you can actually archive the experiment, which, in your view will let you know that that flag is archived, and it basically just shuts off all the controls associated with that feature flag, but that feature flag will still be there in the dashboard for you to be able to view and control it. One thing I forgot to show was the kill switch here, and that's this big green active button. If I were to click on it, I can actually kill this experiment, right? And so with a click of a button, I can set the value of this feature flag to false, and now this feature is turned off across my, for all users in my production environment. We also have this permissions view here, and this is, again, with the audibility, the security, is a big part of it, right? You can control on a user level, permission access to each environment, right? So you can give someone full access in the development environment, but that doesn't mean you want them having full access in the production environment, right? You only want a specific subset of people pushing changes that can affect your features in production, right? And so you can control that in here, and you can also, give some users admin privileges, give other users just regular user privileges. And then what's important to note here is just because somebody is an admin in our Sound Redux application does not mean that they will have any privileges in the other applications, right? So permissions are based on environment level as well as application level. We also have kind of like a fun GitHub integration where basically, you would set that up in here, and any experiment that you create, you can also, once you've linked it to a GitHub repository, it will actually create a YAML configuration file for it, right? So you can do configuration as code with Rollout, and let me show you an example of that. So this is just a little smaller demo environment, similar idea here. We have my following view experiment, and as you can see here, right, I've set it to a 50-50 split, right? And so I've actually linked this specific application to this repository in GitHub, right? And as you can see, my application here, I have two environments, right? I have a production environment and I have a test environment. And then when I go into GitHub, you can see that I actually have a master branch and a test branch, right? So the production environment will always be the master branch when it comes to the GitHub config as code. And then every other environment will have their own branch, right? So let's go into the master branch. This is our production environment, right? And I can actually click into this experiments folder, and it'll show you the two experiments that I have in my dashboard, right? They actually show up as YAML files. And so I can click into my following view YAML file, and you can see here that, it sets out all the configurations and that the value is true for 50% of users, right? And that's the same exact configuration I have in the dashboard. And so I can actually control this experiment via the YAML file, right? So I could actually change this to 30% true instead. Let me change the update true percentage in here, right? And then I click commit changes. And then once I've committed those changes will be reflected in the dashboard as well, right? So now you can see the split change to a 30-70 split. And it works both ways, right? Any change I make in the dashboard, once I update it, it will also be reflected in the YAML config files, right? You can see just now there was a change. I click in here. Now it's a 40% true split as well, right? So this is just a very powerful tool as far as configuration as code goes. Any experiment that you've created, you can control it as code. So again, you can tie this into your permissions and security where you restrict access to who has access to this GitHub repository, and then only they can make changes to the experiments. You can set up automation this way. Any GitOps, GitOps, and like config as code things that you are hopefully already doing, you can also do with Rollout experiments as well. And I could create a brand new YAML file in GitHub, and this would be reflected in the dashboard. That's what I actually did here. I created this YAML file from scratch, and then that created this experiment that you see here, just a generic false experiment. So that's it as far as the demo goes. Let me jump back into the presentation. I have a couple kind of high-level slides to go over here as well. So the first thing I wanted to go over after the demo was the architecture slide, because I mentioned that I would get into that. And so the main thing to notice here is that it's a stateless architecture, and I kind of touched on this before, right? Let me find my pointer here. So I'm drawing this kind of line here. This is the divide between, rollout servers and user devices, right? And so when I save an experiment in the rollout dashboard, right, the rollout servers actually generate a JSON config file, as I've mentioned before, right? And then, that JSON config file is stored in the rollout S3 bucket. And then at the same time, our servers send out a push notification to the user's device via server sent event, right? And this lets the user's device know, hey, there's been a new configuration file created. Come grab it when you're ready, basically, right? So the user's device isn't in constant communication with our servers, right? It's a stateless architecture, but once there is a new configuration file, we let all the user devices know. Then they go ahead and grab those configuration files, and now they can use those configuration files for their feature flag logic, right? And so this kind of architecture was set up for two reasons. One reason was security, as I've mentioned before. No user data is actually exposed to the rollout servers, right? The user data stays on the user devices. So, we create, let's say, a feature flag that will only show to users based on an email property, for example, right? So I hit save, that generates a config file. That config file says only show this feature to users whose email ends at a CloudBees domain, for example, right? But that data isn't stored on our servers, right? We send that off to the user's device, letting them know, okay, now please check, does this user's email end in at cloudbees.com, right? So that logic happens on the user device. So that's the security aspect of this architecture. There's also the aspect of if our servers were to go down, it wouldn't affect the feature flags that are set up on your user devices, right? One, if the servers go down, the user devices still have a configuration file locally, and so they can still check against those configuration files to determine if a feature flag should be true or false, if it should be active or not, right? Even if our servers go down, that doesn't affect the logic of determining if a feature should be displayed for this user or not. The only thing that can happen is if there is a new configuration file created while our servers are down, then your user device won't have that latest configuration file, but none of the feature flag functionality will be affected. Security and privacy, that's always a very big concern when it comes to products such as this, since it is a big SaaS product as well. So we are SOC 2 compliant, run vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, GDPR ready. As I've mentioned, the architecture does not expose customer data to the rollout servers themselves, right? The customer data stays on the user device. There is private and public key signing when it comes to the configuration files. All data is transmitted via SSL. And then we do offer two-factor support and SAML, right? You're able to set up SAML and then single sign-on with SAML if you want for the dashboard authentication itself. And there are the audit logs and the read-write permissions that I've mentioned earlier. This is a little architecture slide for the GitHub configuration as code, which basically highlights, each branch is based on a specific environment. You can have target groups as configs. I only showed off the experiments. Each of them will get their own folder, and just kind of high-level architecture slide of how the configuration and code is actually done. And that's it as far as webinar content goes, the demo and slides and things like that. If this sounds like a tool that you'd be interested in trying out, playing around with, this is a tool that you would be integrating into your code. So we do offer a 2-week free trial of Rollout. We have lots of documentation with different SDKs and things like that. So you can sign up for a free trial and you get 2 weeks to basically play around in the dashboard. It's a full-on free trial. Everything you saw me demo will be available to you in the free trial. We don't restrict anything. And you can go ahead and sign up there at this link for a 2-week free trial as well. Also, I'd like to do a little DevOps World, Jenkins World plug. It's only a couple weeks away, the one in San Francisco. We'll be talking about the future of CloudBees, how we're planning on kind of integrating all of these products together, what our vision is moving towards the future, as well as Rollout specifically, right? The future of Rollout. We'll be talking about that at DevOps World and Jenkins World in San Francisco in a couple of weeks, and then there's also one in Lisbon towards the end of the year. And that's about it. So yeah, thank you for attending. If we have any questions, Max, I'd be happy to answer them.
Absolutely. We do have a fair amount of questions. Some of these have been touched on, but I wouldn't hurt to touch on them again. And some of these are a few people asking similar questions when I kind of combine. So let's start with this one. How do you use feature flags in a way that does not pollute the code with if-else statements?
That's a good question. And so that is kind of one of the drawbacks of feature flags in general, right? Is you are going to be adding a little bit of code into your code base, right? And one thing that happens is once you've added a feature flag into your code, once you're done using that feature flag, it's really important to then go back and clean up that code, right? But a good way to get around it is just to kind of have that as part of your user stories and things like that, right? To make sure that there's a task to go back and remove the feature flags from the code once they're done, right? You don't want to end up leaving a bunch of code that you don't need in your code anymore. As far as polluting the code with if-else statements, it is only right for a couple lines of code, like a little conditional. So in comparison to the code that you're going to be writing for your feature, it's not really adding that much more code, but it is important to keep track of which features are wrapped in feature flags. And that's, again, where having a dashboard that shows you that is really important. And having this kind of archive function, or having this view, and once a feature has been archived or a feature flag has been archived, that kind of lets you know, okay, this feature flag is done with. That should be a signal to you. I can go back into the code. I can remove the if-else statements at this point. So at the end of the day, hopefully your code is not polluted with if-else statements anymore, because you should be getting rid of the feature flags once the features are fully exposed to all of your users.
All right, let's go to this one. Is this only for front-end use, or can it also be used on the back end?
That's a great question. Let me find, so in our documentation, so these are the SDKs that Rollout is currently available for. So as you can see here, there are back-end languages as well. So it is both front-end and back-end. And I think that's really where a tool like Rollout shines, is a lot of times, let's say you have a Java back-end and then JavaScript front-end, you want to push out a feature that encapsulates both back-end and front-end. And that's where a tool with Rollout really shines, is being able to control the feature flags associated with that feature for both platforms in one location. So yeah, there's both back-end and front-end. This little developer tool that I was showing earlier is only available in the front end. That's for developers and testers to be able to test out how their feature behaves in the UI. But these are all the SDKs that Rollout is available for.
All right, let's build on that a little. So referencing the feature flags seems to be language independent. Is that correct? Can it be used for backend in any language just as easily, or even microservices?
Exactly. Yep. So it basically, what it involves is you would import the Rollout SDK into your code, as you saw me do in here, right? Import rocks. So this is the JavaScript SDK. Once you've imported the Rollout SDK into your code in any of these languages, then you can utilize all of the Rollout functionality throughout your code. So in a microservice, monolith, whatever.
All right. Is there a way to ensure a feature is exposed to X% of customers, and also ensure a specific customer is in that X% subset?
Oh, that is an interesting question. So the percentage thing I've touched on, right? That's this kind of split view. But to ensure if a customer is added to that split, I'm actually not sure about. So I know in target groups, you can create more complex logic, right? So you could do a condition where it would match all, for example, right? And so you could make sure that, so specific customer, right? So you can do an email equals one of, to make sure that this specific customer, and then, based on the target group that you create for them, then you could add that into this view as well. But I'm not sure. I think you would want to combine kind of this split on top of a specific customer. So yeah, so the way you would do it, actually, so you would do, let's say, like a 10% split, 90% split, and instead of all users, you would have you would have that like a target group for his specific email or something like that, right? So you would set this to true. So this user would see this feature, but everyone else, 10% of everyone else sees that as well.
All right. Does it come with APIs and integrations to CRM systems to easily track which customers are exposed to the features?
Yes to both. So everything you've seen me do in the dashboard as far as creating an experiment, controlling that experiment, environment control, user control, things like that. There is a REST API, and there's documentation on that here, this REST API documentation. But yeah, you can call the Rollout API to change the value of an existing experiment, for example, or to create a full-on new experiment. As far as integration with CRMs and things like that, we do offer, let me find an impression handler. So, and you can see there's little code examples here in the documentation, but the idea there is we know that a lot of our customers and users probably already have their own analytics tools in place. And so, let's using the JavaScript example, basically anywhere a feature is hit, you can add an impression handler in there. And instead of doing a console.log, right, you could call your own analytics tool, your CRM tool, and kind of report whatever information you want to report to that tool.
All right, great. Let's keep going. I think this will tie in a bit to what you were talking about earlier. How do you manage feature flag deprecation?
Yeah, yep. So again, I think that it's really good that these questions are being asked, because that is one of the pitfalls of using feature flags. Is you don't want to leave unnecessary code in your code base, right? And so I've kind of touched on it before, right? But so in my code right now, right, for example, I have this following view flag. I have this div wrapped in a following view flag, right? And I've created the experiment for it. But let's say I've gotten, and let's say I had a split, 10%, 90% split, and then eventually it's 20%, 80, whatever. And then finally we get to 100% true, right? Once I've gotten to 100% true, and I know that this feature isn't going to cause any problems in my production environment, I decide I don't need the kill switch around it anymore. I've exposed it to all of my customers. You don't need the feature flag around that feature anymore, right? That feature is fully out there. You're done, you've done your experiments, you've exposed to all of your users, right? That's when that feature flag would become deprecated, right? And so the worst thing you could do is just that, leave it as is, leave it editable for somebody to come in here and have them roll it back and then leave the code in there, right? You don't need this code anymore, right? This is that cluttered if-else statement. So now you have this if-else statement that's really not doing anything because it's always going to be true. So at that point, once you've gotten to that 100%, you would actually go in here, you will click Archive Experiment. This will let you know what archiving does, right? It freezes the experiment, it removes it from the active experiments view, but that experiment is now archived. It would show up as red in this view. And then basically once an experiment is gone from this active view, right, you can actually go into this archived view, and that should let you know, okay, this playlist flag, or this playlist experiment, for example, is tied around the playlist feature flag. So that should let you know, okay, now I'm going to go into the code. I'm going to remove all instances of the playlist flag being checked, right? Because the experiment associated with it is done. You don't need the conditionals around it anymore.
All right. Let's see. Are features applied to running processes on the fly or only in deployment time? And is there a local cache that is updated on the processor memory space to minimize access to the feature flag server?
Yeah, so there is local caching, for mobile devices, web application, and it is not only so. Let me see if I have my little architecture slide. So there is that kind of, the server send events, right? Once something is updated in the dashboard, a new configuration file is generated, right? And then we let the user's device know there's a new configuration file, come grab it, right? So every time a new configuration file is generated, then we send out a notification letting the device know that there's a new configuration, and that the device will then grab it and start using that new configuration file. Also, by default, so for mobile devices, for example, it will check for a new configuration on app starts as well, right? Backend languages have polling set up by default, right? So Java, for example, will poll the rollout servers every 30 seconds by default looking for a new configuration file, but that's changeable. You can have it at a slower poll, or you can have it at a faster poll. So yeah, so that's how the servers communicate with the user devices as far as new configurations go.
All right, keep on going. So Is this product for websites or always connected applications versus standalone or embedded applications? Is there a mode that would allow this to be run for standalone or embedded applications?
Yep, there is. So again, as I mentioned, we do send out kind of these notifications that there's a new configuration file ready. But if that's not an option, let me find this. There is a way to do embedded experiments, right? And that's a way for you to be able to, at build time, be able to pack in this, dashboard experiment information, right? So you can actually in the code build a full out experiment, and then at build time you would pack that into your application, and so they would always have this build time configuration ready to go. And so that's how you would handle that kind of like embedded device configurations. That's a good question.
All right, so just so everyone knows, I did put my email into the chat. We're not going to be able to get to all the questions. If we don't get to yours and you want an answer soon, please just shoot me an email, let me know. I'll get you in touch with everyone who can help answer. Let's try to do 2 more before we sign off.
Yep.
So first one, is there an option to import a list of users?
Yes. I don't actually know where it is in the documentation, but there is a way to import, I forget the exact number, it's pretty large, a list of users into the dashboard using TSVs or things like that.
All right, then one more before we sign off. Be mindful of everyone's time. What controls are there on who can update a flag?
Yep, and so that is here in this permissions control, right? So if you were to use the config as code functionality, right, you could restrict that based on your GitHub repository, right? Who you give access to the repository, that's who can update experiments, right? Here, you can also restrict who has access to what environment, right? So maybe I don't have access to the development environment, for example, right? So if I go into the development environment, it's read-only for me and it says that there. So I wouldn't actually be able to update any of the values of this, right? As you can see, this is all grayed out for me. But I have full-on access to the staging environment, so when I go in here, I do have access to these experiments, right? So you can control that via the dashboard. As far as implementing the flags in the code themselves, right? Who has access to your code would be able to implement the flags. And then again, the config is code. Who has access to your repositories, you can restrict it that way, restrict who can edit the experiments and things like that.
All right, I think we have time for one more quick one. So let's just do this before we sign off. Is it possible to create feature flags in the dashboard first, or do you have to create them in the code?
Right, that's a good question. So as I was showing, when I first created the feature flag, I created it in the code, but you can create a feature flag via this drop down here, right? So you can create the feature flag from the UI first, give it whatever name you want, and then it's just important that whatever you name this flag, you obviously implemented this with that same name inside of your container class once you start actually creating the code for it. But yeah, I could create a flag called test flag, here, and I can actually create the experiment around this test flag before this flag even exists in the code, right? I can add all the conditions I want for it before that flag even exists in the code.
All right, we are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it here. Thank you everyone for staying around and watching and all these great questions. Greg, anything you want to say quickly before we go?
No, yeah, thank you for joining the webinar. Hopefully we have some more of these as time goes on. And yeah, thank you for coming.
All right, thanks everyone. That survey is going to pop up real quick. Just asking what you thought, what you'd like to learn more about. And again, if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to email me and I'll get you an answer. Talk to you next time.